Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Imagine breaking your arm. You go to the hospital, the doctor throws an x-ray up on the light board, and you see that jagged white line fracturing the bone, right?
And boom, you have your answer.
Exactly. It's binary, it's clean. I mean, we find a lot of comfort in that kind of medical precision because we like our problems to be, visible, categorized, easily fixed with a cast and some time.
Yeah, but now imagine an injury you can't see on a standard x-ray.
Right.
One that doesn't just heal and return you to normal, but actually fundamentally rewrites how your entire brain interacts with the world around you.
And that brings us to what we're talking about today. Welcome to the deep dive. If you're studying for an exam or just trying to wrap your head around the realities of neurorehabilitation, our mission today is to act as your personal tutors.
Yep, we are opening up Chapter 5 of the Essential Brain Injury Guide today.
We really want to map out the functional impacts of brain injury and the highly specific, outcome-driven rehabilitation used to basically rebuild a person's independence.
It is a heavy topic, for sure, especially if you're encountering this material for the first time as a college student.
Oh, absolutely.
The shift from treating a physical wound to treating a behavioral or cognitive deficit can feel incredibly abstract. Like we said, a broken bone heals, but a brain injury alters the very mechanics of how a person processes their environment.
But there's a really hopeful flip side to this reality, isn't there?
There is, and it's the core paradigm shift of this entire field. If the injury changes how the person interacts with their environment, then, by strategically changing that environment, we can actually help rebuild their independence.
Which is such a fascinating philosophy. But, okay, to understand how we rebuild that independence, we first have to understand what exactly gets dismantled.
Right.
So what actually happens to daily functioning when the brain is injured?
Well, looking at the foundational neurological changes, the text categorizes memory as the most disabling consequence of a brain injury.
Which makes intuitive sense, I think.
Totally. If you can't learn or retain or use new information, every single aspect of living independently becomes a monumental hurdle.
Like from remembering to turn off the stove to learning a new bus route.
Exactly. But the chapter really emphasizes that memory doesn't fail in isolation. It's deeply tied to something called executive functioning.
Executive functioning. Okay,
Yeah.
How should we think about that?
Think of it as the brain's internal CEO. This is the localized system, primarily in the frontal lobes, that manages planning, initiating, and monitoring your own behavior.
So when the CEO goes offline, you kind of lose the overarching management of your daily life.
You do. And the biological cascade of that failure is profound. Consider the sensorimotor changes, for instance. It's rarely just one physical issue.
Right.
A patient might have impaired vision, but then you combine that with severe balance and coordination problems, which is a condition known as ataxia.
And that combination basically destroys their spatial orientation, right?
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're clumsy. Their brain is failing to compute where their body is in physical space.
That has to create a terrifying environment for the patient, which honestly completely explains the massive spikes in anxiety and agitation we see in the clinical examples.
Oh, absolutely. The world becomes physically unpredictable to them. And then, add to that the speech and language impairments.
Like expressive and receptive aphasia?
Exactly. With expressive aphasia, the person knows exactly what they want to say, but the brain's circuitry just can't physically coordinate finding and producing the words.
And receptive is the opposite.
Right. Receptive aphasia is where the auditory hardware works fine, but the brain can't decode the meaning of the words others are saying. It sounds like a foreign language to them.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this next one because it always trips people up. And my own instinct was totally wrong here. The text talks about initiation impairments.
Yeah, failing to start tasks.
Right, so does a lack of initiation mean the person just doesn't want to do something, or is it a literal neurological roadblock? Because if I see someone sitting in a chair refusing to engage in physical therapy, my first thought is, oh, they're depressed, or just being stubborn.
That is the most common and honestly most dangerous misconception in brain injury rehabilitation. We tend to project neurotypical motivations onto injured neurology.
So it's not a character flaw.
Not at all. It is a literal biological roadblock in the brain circuitry. Think of it like a car with a severed starter cable.
Oh, okay.
The engine is fine, the gas tank is full, the driver actively wants to go to the store, but the signal to ignite simply cannot travel from the key to the engine. The brain is failing to send the go signal to the muscles.
So treating them like they're just being obstinate is essentially punishing them for a severed wire.
Precisely. And understanding that cause and effect reasoning, that it's biology, not obstinance, frames our entire philosophy of rehabilitation.
And does this same biological vulnerability explain the severe risks surrounding substance abuse?
Yes, it does.
Because the statistics in the chapter are jarring, and the timeline is fascinating. Like, right after an injury, substance abuse might not be an issue because they're in a restricted hospital setting, but the risks skyrocket the moment a patient regains access to the community.
Well, yeah, because you have a perfect storm of environmental and neurological factors colliding. Imagine this individual returning home. They're dealing with intense new isolation and a devastating awareness of their cognitive limitations.
Plus the clinical depression from the trauma itself.
Right. And their brain's internal CEO is offline, meaning their impulse control is severely compromised. If they reconnect with pre-injury friends who misuse substances, the neurological defense mechanisms that might have said no in the past are simply gone.
The vulnerability is just immense. So given all these overlapping deficits, the memory loss, the severed initiation cables, how do clinicians actually plan a recovery? You can't just put a cast on executive functioning.
You really can't. Which brings us to the 8-step treatment planning process, specifically what the text calls outcome-driven rehabilitation.
Okay, outcome-driven rehabilitation. What's the anchor point there?
The primary focus of any plan is the discharge site. Before a clinician writes a single goal, they have to know where this person is going next. Home, school, structured living.
Because the physical environment dictates the skills they need to learn.
Exactly. But the fundamental driver must always be the individual's choice.
Let's bring up the chapter's chart regarding Rhonda as a case example. They explain how the broad outcome for Rhonda is independent mobility in the community.
Right, but be independent is way too broad for someone with cognitive deficits.
So it gets broken down into a goal, which is that Rhonda will independently access public transportation.
But even that requires a dozen micro skills. So that goal is sliced down into measurable objectives. The text uses this exact one, using a bus schedule, to find a time to go to the mall with 100% accuracy for 5 days.
It's like using a GPS.
How do you mean?
Well, you can't get turn-by-turn directions, the objectives, until you and the patient explicitly agree on the final destination, the outcome.
That is a perfect analogy. And that level of granular, observable measurement, like the 100% accuracy for 5 days, is required to ensure those domains of functioning are actually being mastered.
Which leads perfectly into my next question. How do we know if these microscopic objectives are actually working? How are they tracking this?
To decode that, clinicians use ABC data. That stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence.
Right. To understand the environmental influences, let's explicitly describe the ABC chart from the text. A staff member asks a person with severe cognitive problems, "What do you want for dinner?" That's the antecedent.
Will trigger.
Yep. Then the behavior is the person throwing their food. And the consequence is that the person escapes the demanding situation because the staff member backs off.
Exactly. The open-ended question required immense executive functioning. It was neurologically overwhelming.
So instead of punishing the throwing, you change the antecedent.
Right. You ask a simple yes or no question, would you like chicken? By changing that, the unwanted behavior is prevented entirely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Why does the chapter make such a big deal out of measuring the rate of a behavior instead of just counting the frequency?
Because frequency can lie to you. Let's use the chapter's exact vocational training example. Say someone have 8 acts of aggression in 8 hours on Monday.
Okay, so that's a rate of 1 per hour.
Right. Then on Tuesday, they have 4 acts of aggression, but they were only in the program for 2 hours.
Oh, wow. So if you just look at frequency, going from 8 to 4 looks like they're improving.
Exactly. But measuring the rate, which is 2 per hour on Tuesday versus 1 per hour on Monday, reveals the behavior is actually getting worse.
That's wild. Okay, so we've got the data collection down, but how do we actually rebuild the skills? Let's move to the teaching toolkit.
The very first step for the transdisciplinary team is to identify positive reinforcers. You use the PREMAC principle.
Which is using a highly preferred activity to reinforce a less preferred task, right? Like the text's example of letting someone wear a Sony Walkman if they arrive on time.
Yes, a very retro example, but it perfectly illustrates the concept. Then you use specific methods like task analysis. That's breaking down a complex skill, like toothbrushing, into 6 distinct, manageable steps.
And shaping.
Shaping is reinforcing closer approximations. So, rewarding a haphazardly pulled sheet before demanding a perfectly made bed.
I love the visual example the text gives for fading. Using a placemat with bold outlines of plates and silverware and slowly making the outlines fainter and fainter until the natural cues of the room take over.
It's a great clinical tool.
So fading is essentially like putting training wheels on a bike, and shaping is rewarding the kid just for getting on the seat before you expect them to pedal.
That's a great way to put it. And alongside those, we have incidental teaching.
Like the burnt toast scenario.
Exactly. A patient burns their toast in the kitchen. Instead of the therapist fixing the toast or scolding them, they use that unprogrammed mistake as a real-time troubleshooting lesson.
But wait, all these clinical techniques require a human being to implement them. The brain injury specialist, or BIS.
Right. And they are vital because they see the patient in natural, unguarded settings. The guidelines are strict, stay calm, avoid arguments, use humor, and most importantly, don't take things personally.
But wait, if a patient is yelling at you or verbally attacking you, how do you not take that personally?
Because of the core psychological thesis of this chapter, all behavior is lawful. Unwanted behavior is just a product of brain damage interacting with the environment. It's not about you.
To prove how invisible the environment is, the text recounts that college professor experiment.
Oh, the operant conditioning experiment.
Yes. The students unconsciously conditioned their professor to deliver his entire lecture from the left side of the room just by looking interested when he stood there and acting bored when he moved away.
It's incredible. It proves how powerfully the environment shapes us without us even knowing it.
Building on that, how do we apply those laws of reinforcement to stop dangerous or unwanted behaviors like aggression?
Well, we look at the 4 environmental influences. Rewards, which is positive reinforcement. Escape or avoidance, which is negative reinforcement. Punishment and extinction.
And well-meaning staff accidentally mess this up all the time, don't they?
All the time. They accidentally use positive reinforcement by giving deep counseling and attention right after an outburst, which just rewards the behavior. Or negative reinforcement by letting a patient skip painful physical therapy because they got aggressive.
So what's the clinical decision-making process there?
You must use the least restrictive means. Instead of punishing, we teach adaptive replacements. We also use redirection. When a patient is perseverating or agitated, trying to reason with them just escalates it.
You just change the focus entirely, like bringing up a favorite TV show.
Exactly. Shift the track completely.
This brings us back to the substance abuse section. The chapter notes that traditional AA programs rarely work for this population because of cognitive deficits regarding abstract concepts like sobriety.
Right. When the frontal lobe is damaged, abstract thought is compromised. They need adapted group therapy, specifically trained counselors, and a framework where relapse is viewed as part of recovery, not a moral failure.
The text mentions some really simple, practical tools for all this, too. Daily planners for memory and laminated cue cards with 4 to 5 de-escalation steps that the patient reads at the first sign of anger.
Yes. It's all about building external architecture to replace the internal architecture that was lost. Brain injury recovery isn't just about healing tissue. It's about painstakingly decoding the environment.
By combining an understanding of neurological deficits with careful data tracking and honestly immense empathy, clinicians give patients the tools to author their own independence.
That is the perfect summary.
Well, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, but I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If a room full of college students can accidentally train a professor to stand in a corner, think about the subtle, invisible ways you are reinforcing the behavior of the people in your own life every single day without even realizing it.
It really makes you evaluate your own daily interactions.
It really does. Thank you for studying with us, and a warm thank you from all of us here at the Last Minute Lecture Team. You've got this.